Zealous advocates, alarmists, followers of a substitute religion. They're the descriptions of John Howard overnight in an address in London about how he sees the new activism for those who want action on climate change. Is it really that bad, or is it, as others suggest, simply based on science? Our Wednesday regular on Breaking Politics is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Joshua Frydenberg. Josh, welcome back to the studio.
Nice to be with you, Tim.
Is John Howard right, or is he being a bit alarmist in reverse about those who call the science?
Look, I've got a huge amount of respect for John Howard. Not only was he Australia's second longest serving Prime Minister, but a very good Prime Minister at that, and somebody indeed I work for. The debate, though, for us in the coalition is not about the science. The debate is what is the best measure to deal effectively with climate change, and we don't believe the carbon tax was the right way to go. We do believe that direct action is, and that's why we'll be prosecuting that in the Parliament.
Right, so the debate isn't about the science in the coalition, and yet the beloved John Howard is going out and making it about the science, isn't he? He's calling it into question.
Well, I fully respect John Howard's right to make the comments that he sees fit and consistent with his views, and they're often extremely important views and ones that should be heard, and these are no different. But in terms of the coalition's position, we're not debating the science, we're actually putting forward an alternative to the carbon tax, which is direct action.
So in that sense, the coalition has moved on from John Howard, at least in his views.
Look, I think these are the words of Tony Abbott many times in the public arena, Tim, which is the coalition is committed to the bipartisan target of a 5% reduction by 2020. And to do that, we realise we need to have a direct action plan, and that's why we're putting that forward. So that's our position.
Given that is your position, at the very least, to have such a father figure of the party out saying these things is a little embarrassing, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely not. This is a free country, and particularly on this issue where there are passionate views on both sides of the political divide and on both sides of the particular debate. They should be heard in the public, and we should respect people's right to say it.
Now, some suggestion the day after the first Tuesday in November that there was a ban on Abbott government frontbenchers attending the Melbourne Cup yesterday. That's in the media this morning. Was there?
Not that I'm aware of, and I was invited to the Melbourne Cup, but decided not to go, and nobody told me that I could or I couldn't go. So I'm not aware where that notion of the ban coming from.
So no limitations on any front benchers if they wanted to attend?
Look, the front benchers are entitled to fill their diaries they see fit, but as you can understand, Tim, it's a very busy time with Parliament coming back next week, with ministers settling into their new portfolios with heavy responsibilities to unwind many of the terrible measures that were introduced by the last government. We're all very busy, and so therefore I'm sure a lot of people took that into account when making decisions on what they would do on Cup Day.
Well, I think one of the suggestions here is that the ministerial expenses issue has kicked along so much, now would not be a good time for front benchers to be seen sipping champagne and hoity-toity at Flemington.
Well, I know
Fair comment.
Well, I think that the entitlements issue is certainly bubbling along, to excuse the pun. But I noticed that Anthony Albanese has been down to the Melbourne Cup in previous years and claimed expenses for that. Look. I just think that people make their own decisions based on what is feasible in their diary.
Just on that point with Anthony Albanese, Barnaby Joyce also criticised for going to sporting events and as his ministerial duty, actually flying to the sporting event, not to another.
It's a bit rich, isn't it? For the Labor Party or others to criticise Barnaby Joyce without looking at the repeat offenders on the other side.
Now, there is plenty of foreign policy around, and you have particular interest in that. How severely have our relations with Jakarta been hit by these suggestions of Australians spying inside our Jakarta embassy?
Look, I think Julie Bishop is over there in Indonesia, and she understands the country very well and has a very good relationship with her counterpart there, Marty Nalagawa. Tony Abbott had a fantastic visit to Jakarta to meet with Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono just weeks coming into office, and there was some good agreements there. And then also the meeting at Bali for APEC was also a victory for Tony Abbott in terms of his foreign policy agenda. So I think the relationship with Indonesia is in very good shape under the coalition government. I point out to you, Tim, that when John Howard was Prime Minister, he dealt with 5 Indonesian presidents, and that relationship went through a number of difficult phases, including the Asian economic crisis, including the tsunami, including the Bali bombing, and so forth. And I think you'll always get ups and downs in any important bilateral relationship, but at the end of the day, it's on a pretty sound footing.
Is it really in good shape if the Foreign Affairs Minister of Indonesia is saying to us we need explicit assurances that spying will not be going on in the Australian Embassy? That's not great.
Well, in terms of intelligence matters, as Julie Bishop has said, they're not for public discussion per se, but in terms of the bilateral relationship, you've got to understand there is a lot of cooperation behind the scenes as we deal with the mutual problems of counter-terrorism, and we deal with the problems of people smuggling, and so it's in both countries' interest to cooperate on those issues.
An academic from the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University, Raoul Heinrichs, writes that the Abbott government appears to be setting a new standard for diplomatic ineptitude. Now, his razor-sharp criticism of the government particularly points to the Prime Minister and Foreign Affairs Minister saying of Japan that Japan is our best friend in Asia.
Well, that's just rubbish what Heinrich has said in this article. Tony Abbott has hit the ground running in terms of foreign policy, and as I said, the first visit that he made was to Jakarta, where he got an agreement from SBY to work bilaterally on the issue of people smuggling. APEC was also a very successful visit, so too was the East Asian Summit. There was a very good rapport between Tony Abbott and his prime ministerial and presidential counterparts from other countries. When it comes to Japan, Tony Abbott, as I remember, said exactly that about Japan being our best friend in Asia when he was in opposition. So it would be a bit inconsistent were he not to repeat the same comment as in government. And the point with Japan is that we've had extensive cooperation, not just in the trade area, but in the security area, in disaster relief, and they've been a great friend, particularly since Prime Minister Menzies and Japanese Prime Minister Kishi in 1957 entered into that landmark historic economic and trading relationship.
On one other point that Heinrichs makes in the piece that he has written, was it smart for Tony Abbott to place a one-year deadline on a free trade agreement with China and perhaps encourage China to sit on their hands, go slower, not faster, and let the political pain on Tony Abbott force some Australian compromises?
Look, absolutely it was the right call by Tony Abbott to say how important it is to conclude an FTA with China in hopefully what is the next 12 months. But we will only do a good deal, we will not do a bad deal. And that's the important caveat on that point. But let's put this issue in context, Tim. In 2005, Australia and China entered into free trade negotiations for an agreement under John Howard. It was the same year that China and New Zealand entered into negotiations for an FTA. China and New Zealand concluded their agreement in 2008, and there's been a dramatic increase in bilateral trade. We're 8 years later and there has been no agreement. So Labor really failed to conclude FTAs with our key partners, Korea, China and Japan. And now we're under Andrew Robb's stewardship, we're committed to concluding those agreements.
Josh Frydenberg, looking forward to the resumption of Parliament?
Absolutely.
Be fun?
It should be fun, and we'll put Bill Shorten to the test, no doubt about that.
We'll be looking forward to seeing you in the studio again next week. Thanks for coming on Breaking Politics.
Thanks for having me, Tim.